President Donald Trump ignores a US congressional deadline to respond to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. So, what happens next? And despite mounting international pressure, will Saudi Arabia ever be held accountable for the killing? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobbie. It's been more than 4 months since the journalist Jamal Khashoggi was murdered inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, and since then there have been widespread calls for an international investigation and demands to hold the Saudi government to account. But the US President Donald Trump has largely stood by his ally, the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The US President has now missed a Friday deadline to tell Congress who's responsible for the killing of Khashoggi. Instead, his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, wrote a letter to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, insisting that the Trump administration will seek accountability for the murder. A leading member of that committee, Senator Bob Menendez, says the response isn't good enough. And the United Nations is the latest to demand answers too. Its special rapporteur on extrajudicial executions called Khashoggi's death a brutal and premeditated killing. Agnes Callamard released her initial findings after a week-long trip to Turkey. She says Saudi Arabia has seriously undermined the murder investigation. We'll bring in our guest in just a moment. First, Mike Hanna sets up our discussion today from Washington.
President Trump departs for his annual medical exam, declining to answer shouted questions on any subject. All indications are there'll be no response to the deadline set by the Senate. Following the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Senate sent a letter to President Trump invoking the Global Magnitsky Act, which gave President Trump 120 days to investigate the murder and impose sanctions against those responsible. In a follow-up letter, the Senate asked the president to specifically investigate any role the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, may have played in the murder.
MBS, the Crown Prince, is a wrecking ball. I think he's complicit in the murder of Mr. Khashoggi. I think he's crazy. I think he is dangerous, and he has put the relationship at risk.
But President Trump has steadfastly insisted the US-Saudi relationship is more important than establishing accountability for murder.
It's all about America first. We're not going to give up hundreds of billions of dollars in orders and let Russia, China, and everybody else have them. It's all about, for me, very simple. It's America first.
Saudi Arabia's senior diplomat continues to deny any involvement by the kingdom's leaders in the murder, refusing to react to a New York Times report that the Crown Prince is on record as saying he would use a bullet on Jamal Khashoggi. The report dismissed as based on unknown sources, and the following tweet posted on the Saudi Foreign Ministry account: "We will hold who are responsible for the death of Khashoggi to account." The question is, what happens now the president has ignored the ultimatum? The answer is simply nothing. There are no punitive measures involved in this process, which essentially relies on the good faith of all parties, something the president's critics contend is absent in the White House. But this does not mean an end to the matter. The question of accountability for Jamal Khashoggi's murder has rare bipartisan support in Congress.
And the motion is agreed to.
And legislation seeking sanctions against Saudi Arabia, and possibly the Crown Prince specifically, is being widely discussed in both House and Senate. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Okay, let's get going. Let's bring in the panel today. Joining us on Skype from Birmingham in the UK is Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at the University of Birmingham. Political strategist Selva is in Istanbul. And in Manchester, we have Drew Liquerman, Vice Chairman of Republicans Overseas UK. Welcome to you all. Drew Liquerman, Mr. Donald Trump has missed this deadline. What does that mean?
Well, I think there's two things to note about Trump missing the deadline. And I want to say I'm someone who's a very strong supporter of Article 1 in the Constitution, congressional powers and presidential powers, and I think President Trump should respond to the deadline. But this government shutdown of well over a month definitely put a dent in time needed to do an actual thorough investigation And the second thing to note is that Congress is still, or sorry, the State Department, Trump's political appointments in the State Department are still frequently updating congressional leaders, Democrats and Republicans, and should hopefully soon have a letter out. And who knows what that letter will say? Maybe it'll say or it'll say for who's responsible.
Okay, a letter from the State Department isn't quite an answer to my question. What I asked you was, or to put it in a stronger way, Mr. Trump has deliberately missed this deadline. He is, in effect, turning his back not just on claims in the media, not just on the Washington Post. He's turning his back on what the CIA has been saying.
Yeah, well, like I said about Trump missing the deadline, 30 to 40% of the time that this investigation where a report should have been come out for who did this, the government was shut down. The State Department and the government were effectively shut down and making this task an impossible task to determine who was responsible and a full report on who was responsible. And I think the State Department will be coming out with a report soon. And from what I've heard and what I think and what it looks like, it will be saying that Saudi Arabia is taking internal measures to, well, they are already taking internal measures to go after seeking even the death penalty on people who were responsible for the killing of Khashoggi.
Scott Lucas in Birmingham, coming to you now. This comes down to personal culpability, surely, and everyone doesn't just think it was the Crown Prince who greenlit this. Everyone believes it was the Crown Prince, yes or no?
Yes, U.S. intelligence agency thinks it, State Department thinks it. Let's deal with Drew's point. I mean, if you're going to spin this, Drew, at least make it believable. This had nothing to do with the government shutdown, why the White House didn't respond yesterday. It has nothing to do with the preparation of a detailed report. The fact of the matter is that for 4 months, U.S. intelligence agencies and the State Department and the military believe that Mohammed bin Salman is responsible for this. We know that Congress, including Republicans who normally support Trump, want accountability, but we know that Donald Trump is holding out against that. Why? Because Donald Trump's envoy to the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, is Jared Kushner, his son-in-law. Jared Kushner is very close to MBS. So you have two U.S. foreign policies right now. You have a foreign policy which is coming out of Congress, coming out of the CIA, and parts of the State Department. And then you have a Trump foreign policy, which is a family and friends foreign policy. And that's what's protecting MBS at this point. The question is not if Trump's going to change his position. He's not. But how far Congress will go to try to hold not only MBS, but also Trump accountable for what is the murder of a journalist and wider human rights abuses.
Salvatore, you're there in Istanbul at the heart of this ongoing saga. So clearly this is going to generate more political anger and heat in Washington. What will it do to the political debate taking place in your country?
Well, Turkey's position was very clear from the very beginning. This was a brutal murder. Premeditated, of course, and it is obviously we find out that there are some unknown personalities within the government of Saudi Arabia who actually ordered this brutality. I agree totally with the professor in Birmingham that it has nothing to do with the shutdown. I mean, this is actually a political decision of Mr. Trump, either to act accordingly to Magnitsky Act or not. So he is now breaching its own law by definition. When it comes to Turkey, of course, in search of the truth and in search of the facts. I mean, as we look to the preliminary report of the United Nations, it is obviously very, in line with what has previously Turkish government has said before. But of course, United Nations process has just begun. It is a preliminary report. It doesn't, the Security Council need to decide that there needs to be an investigation council has to be set up. But I don't have any assumption that the Security Council will decide accordingly because of the fact that the Trump administration's behavior. But on the other side, when we look to the international political perspective, Mr. Trump has opened and created a safety zone for all the other autocratic leaders who would like to, engage in crimes and, do whatever they can to silence their oppositions. Unfortunately, it is not a moral act, and we have to debate more on this, I guess, in the future.
Drew Liquerman in Manchester, just picking up on that point there that Salva's raising, do you see the sense of where she's coming from, the logic of it? And there is logic in it, and it's this. If you're an autocrat, as far as Mr. Trump's concerned, we're okay with that because as long as we're doing business with you, what if that costs a journalist his life?
Well, no, look, that's completely wrong. I want to say I don't support everything that goes on in Saudi Arabia and everything they do outside of it, and I want people held accountable. And the point about the government shutdown is I strongly don't think a detailed report would be done with 40% of the time cut for having it to be. That being on the other hand, our relationship with Saudi Arabia, it's second to what's going on in Yemen. I think the people who are trying to push this through Congress, push sanctions on Saudi Arabia, the point of it is to end U.S. support of Saudi, the UAE, and the joint operation in Yemen, which is effectively fighting off Houthi, Iranian proxies, and al-Qaeda for controlling Yemen, which would in turn give them control of the Bab al-Mandab Straits, meaning they could shut down the Red Sea, and they'd have control of the Strait of Hormuz. They could shut down the Persian Gulf, effectively giving Iran full control over the Red Sea and over the Persian Gulf. And this is what it's about. I don't think this is about our relationship about Saudi Arabia, about what's going on in Saudi Arabia. It's about protecting global shipping, and it's about protecting sovereign nations from Iran coming in and putting their terrorist proxies in to control the region.
Okay, Drew, I don't particularly want to get into catastrophizing about what may or may not happen 6 months or 12 months down the line vis-a-vis Yemen. However, Scott Lucas in Birmingham, Drew does raise a valid point there. The vote or the attitude, the political attitude to do with Khashoggi in Washington, we've got to overlap or blend in certain elements of America's attitude towards what's happening in Yemen and the proxy conflict that Drew is talking about, don't we?
Let's cut through Drew's nonsense, because what he's just done is just accused, for example, Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican, a close ally of Donald Trump, and the CIA of being allies of Iran in a conspiracy to try to pull the U.S. out of Yemen. Let's get to what the real point here is. I think that U.S. agencies and U.S. Congress will not be able to go after MBS. They won't be able to hold him responsible. But where you might see the effect is because many congressmen are so angry and the agencies are so unsettled by what Trump has done, there may be a move for legislation which will cut U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia and possibly end U.S. support for the Saudi-led intervention, which includes the UAE, in the Yemeni civil war. You've got that on the one side. But the problem is that on the other side, you've got the Trump administration, which is pursuing regime change in Iran. So if you go too hard against the Saudis over Yemen, if you go too hard against MBS, you pretty much undercut that Trump administration approach, which is to change the leadership in Tehran. Which way does U.S. foreign policy go? To actually try to hold the Saudis to account, or to say, put our hands up and say, nah, it's all about Iran, and we'll release the pressure on MBS and on the Yemen intervention?
President Donald Trump has refused to hold Saudi Arabia and, more specifically, the Crown Prince accountable for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. In November, he contradicted a CIA assessment that concluded Mohammed bin Salman did order the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. And shortly thereafter, Trump said, "We may never know all of the facts surrounding the murder of Jamal Khashoggi," while defending U.S. relations with Riyadh and calling the kingdom a great ally. But he's also said Saudi Arabia's response to the murder has been the worst cover-up ever. So, Salvatore in Istanbul, Mr. Trump over the past 4.5 months has been blowing hot and cold over who did what when. Does your president, does Recep Tayyip Erdogan, given what Mr. Trump has just done, turning his back on this deadline, on this CIA-imposed deadline, does he have to accept, does Mr. Erdogan have to accept that the prime directive for Washington is the Washington-Riyadh relationship, and that is first and foremost all that Mr. Trump is interested in?
Well, occasionally and in many other cases, Mr. Erdogan has declared that Turkey's position is clear and not to be changed, and that is to find out the real responsible bodies of this brutal murder of Mr. Khashoggi. On the other side, of course, there is a regional political power game that we never forget about it. Mr. Trump's decisions or declarations are always, a little bit mind-blowing time to time. When he said something in the morning, he could be regretting in the evening. So if we look to the general American foreign policy establishment into the Middle East, we see more or less the same priorities. One of the priorities is the security of Israel. The other priority is controlling the production cost over oil pricing. And the third priority is the priorities of the American defense industry, which Trump is obviously, prioritizing all the time.
Talking about Lindsey Graham, it's significant, surely. It's a measure of how isolated your president is here, that he turns his back on this CIA deadline. Lindsey Graham describes the Crown Prince as being beyond toxic. Point number one, I want you to answer. And point number two as well. Trump says the relationship is with the country. It's not with individuals. If that's the case, why does his son-in-law, who is the springboard towards, we're told, a new Middle East peace policy, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has a wonderfully warm, rich WhatsApp relationship with the Crown Prince? How does that work?
Well, so on the first point, look, I mean, I agree with that. Like I said before, I want to see whoever did this held accountable, and we have to have a way that we can go after individual people but not affect our foreign policy that's been built up over the last years, our foreign policy, which I see as being effective. We have to find out a way to do this, I think, with that. And then second part also, we were talking about with arms sales and ending arms sales. No, look, I don't want to see arms sales ended either. I mean, it's going to be very tough for the Senate and Trump to go to Kansas, to go to Oklahoma.
Sorry, Drew, let me interrupt you. You do or you do not want to see arms sales stopped?
I do not.
So the business of selling, just to be clear, the business of selling arms to Saudi Arabia for you is worth more than snuffing out the life of the voice of a dissenting journalist.
No, look, I think like I said, Saudi Arabia needs to be held accountable, and the U.S. should be monitoring what weapons we're selling to them. But at the same time, a deal that's been done already, President Trump and the Republicans, imagine them going to tell 10, 15,000 workers, sorry, you're laid off, you can't feed your family, because Saudi Arabia went after Jamal Khashoggi, and it was disgusting what they did. It was terrible what they did to him. But, we shouldn't pretend this was some Washington Post journalist who was some moral, ethical guy. He was getting money from foreign governments. He was writing in support of the Muslim Brotherhood. He mentioned Muslim Brotherhood members who have said that Hitler was divine intervention.
Okay, Drew, before you go off, before you go off the high board of trying to libel or slander somebody who's dead, I'm going to stop you in your tracks there, because I know Scott wants to come in. Scott, you would like to react to those points?
Well, I mean, first of all, look, we can talk about Jamal Khashoggi. We can talk about his political views. We can talk about his journalism, quite often brave journalism, to try to label him through some type of Islamophobia because you want to smear him as Muslim Brotherhood or Al-Qaeda. That's beyond bounds. Let's pick up, I think, on what the substantial point is here. And I want to actually address Salva as well.
You know that. He's written in support of Qaradawi, who said Hitler was divine intervention.
True. You've got no clue about what is happening with the Muslim Brotherhood. You've got no clue about Islam. You've got no clue about Middle Eastern politics. So don't try to use scare quotes to try to slander someone who's dead and evade the issue.
So did Qaradawi not say that Hitler was divine intervention to punish the Jews? Am I wrong or right about that, Scott?
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to stop both of you there. I'm going to stop both of you there because the clock is ticking, and I do not want to go down the road of having a debate about the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamophobia, or whether Hitler was divine intervention or not. We simply do not have time to have that argument over a cup of coffee. We can maybe do that another time. But one point to you, Scott. There are calls for the process, the legal process, to be allowed to go full time on this. That's basically what the Saudi foreign minister is saying. And also there are calls being leveled at Riyadh saying full disclosure. What are the chances that we get full disclosure?
That depends on three rings in what has become a very tragic circus. The first is, let's establish that the Saudis are trying to play for time. They're hoping this will all just go away. And you've heard Drew try to make it all go away by saying, well, arms sales are the priority. So the U.S. ring is the first. Will the U.S. Congress press this? The second ring actually comes through the United Nations, because now that you have the initial report, which has come from the special rapporteur, how much does the UN try to complete this process no matter how high it reaches. And the third, and this is what I'd like to hear Salva's reaction to, it comes back to Turkey. Because this isn't just a question of the Turkish investigation. There is a rivalry between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, whether you talk about the position in Syria, whether you talk about the position in the Gulf, including the Yemeni conflict, and the wider leadership of the Muslim world. And I think as long as Turkey really wants to press this, not only as a question of whether MBS should be held accountable, but in a way trying to play out that regional influence game, then I think it won't go away, no matter how much Riyadh tries to wish it to be so.
Salva, would you like to pick up on that point that Scott is making? And can I also add on to that? There is a panel finding due in the month of June. So it's due, what, March, April, May? It's due in 3.5 months' time-ish. If that panel says what we've heard already, which is the CIA believes the Crown Prince, in effect, ordered the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, does that give Erdogan more leverage here, despite Donald Trump's reaction, or lack of a reaction?
Well, MBS is held accountable for this brutal murder. It has nothing to do, in the end, between the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Turkey. I totally agree with a professor in Birmingham. Yet the regional power game is more or less between U.S. and Turkey rather than Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Because our initial national security issues is jeopardized not by Saudi Arabia initially, but by United States foreign policy priorities. Saying which, that MBS's position in the government in Saudi Arabia is, for the next couple of decades, would create a tremendous effect on regional conflicts, because his attitude and his policies that we obviously been aware of is creating more conflicts in between countries, and not for the peace, of course. But when it comes to American foreign policy making, I think rather than making some new conflicts, United States had to pursue for more peace, but with the eligible and, of course, legitimate partners within the region.
Let's boil this all down to you, Drew Liquerman in Manchester. Mr. Al-Jabeer, the Saudi foreign minister, is being quoted in the Washington Post as saying the Crown Prince did not order the killing. Can I suggest to you that for the Trump administration, that's a very nuanced take on a very complex situation, where basically what we're saying here is that strategic ignorance that was fed up the way, as far as the Saudis are concerned, should equate to strategic innocence. And everyone else thinks that the word innocence cannot be applied here, particularly to the Crown Prince.
Look, like I said, I think people need to be held accountable. It was disgusting what happened to him. I hope to see that justice run its course in due time. But look, I don't have any inside information that isn't known out right now. I'm sure that the Crown Prince MBS, at the very least, ordered his capture, and who knows what happened then, or if not ordered his murder. And look, like I said, I'd like to see justice carried out, people going after, but at the same time, I don't want to see this totally upend and destroy the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and destroy our foreign policy interests in the Middle East. And I think also it's very concerning right now. A lot of countries are using this very disgusting and sad murder that happened to Khashoggi to further their own interests. Qatar and Turkey being each. Turkey, this is a country that holds how many journalists in jail right now after the last attempted revolution? So I think the U.S.
I mean,
right
excuse
now,
me. May I interrupt?
Look, we need to go.
May I interrupt? This is nothing to do. This is nothing to do with Turkey's domestic. No. This has nothing to do with domestic politics. You have to talk about
Turkey and Saudi Arabia's clashing interests.
The level of morality of U.S. policies in the Middle East must be our foremost discussion point. When it comes to Turkey's jailing journalists and so on and so forth, this is a democratic discussion that we made on democratic terms in Turkey. Yet Turkey did have many other experiences, unfortunate experiences, which you might very well know about. The fact that
Salva
majority
and
of the
Drew, I'm
journalists
going to have to pull a plug on our
so-called-
conversation,
I mean,
for which I apologise. The conversation about journalists in Turkey is a conversation we've had on the programme. We simply do not have the time left to go off at a tangent and start discussing that now. But Salva, thank you for coming back on that particular point. So thanks to all our guests. They were Scott Lucas, Salva Thor and Drew Liquerman. And thank you to you too for your company. You can see the programme again anytime via the website, aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can talk to us on Twitter @AJ Inside Story or tweet me. I'm @PeterDobbie1 from me and the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. I will see you very soon. Bye-bye. Okay.